taxonomy of the exile, a synthesis of physicalism, historiography, and the Hebrew identity. Introduction, the convergence of logic and prophecy. To synthesize the intellectual journey taken this morning is to map the collision between two irreconcilable worlds, the physical language of the modern West and the covenantal reality of the indigenous Hebrew, the Ibri. At the center of this synthesis lies Rudolf Carnap's Psychology and Physical Language. Carnap's 1932 thesis, translated by George Schinick, argues that for psychology to be a valid science, it must be stripped of its metaphysical soul and translated into a language of observable physical processes. However, for the indigenous Hebrew, this translation is not a neutral scientific exercise. It is the theological blueprint for the proverbs and bywords described in Deuteronomy 28 and 37. This synthesis examines how the physicalist reductionism of Carnap, the historical records of Flavius Josephus, 1957, the sociological histories of Solomon Grazel, 1947, and Israel Abraham's, 1958, the anthropological taxonomies of Beals and Hoyger, and the linguistic archaeology of William Chomsky, 1957, all converge to explain the psychological imprisonment and the potential awakening of the scattered tribes of Ashkelon. 1. The Carnapian prison. Redefining the soul as a physical process. The foundation of our analysis is Carnap's insistence on physicalism. Carnap sought to create a unified science where every sentence could be verified through his intersubjective observation. In his view, to say a man is sorrowful or spiritually broken is meaningless unless it can be translated into a protocol sentence describing his bodily movements, heart rate, or verbal outputs. The Ibri critique. As an indigenous Hebrew, I recognize that this methodology is the ultimate tool of the colonizer. By removing the metaphysical from the human experience, the world was able to ignore the spiritual status of the Israelite. If the spirit does not exist in physical language, then the curse of the law does not exist. Our suffering is reduced to psychological trauma, and our identity is reduced to phenotype. Carnap's philosophy provides the scientific permission to treat the Hebrew not as a covenant bearer, but as a biological specimen. 2. The architecture of the byword from protocol to proverb. The most devastating application of physicalism is the creation of the byword. When the indigenous Hebrew was brought into captivity, he was stripped of his tribal names Judah, Ephraim, Gad, and rebranded with protocol sentences based on physical observation: Niger, nigger, black, reducing a nation to a light absorption property of the skin; Indian, savage, reducing an indigenous sovereign to a geographic error or a behavioral primitive state; Marano, mulatto, reducing a spiritual convert or a child of mixed lineage to the status of animals, pigs and mules; Latino, Hispanic, reducing a tribal identity to the language of a conquering Latin master. These are what Carnap would call intersubjective terms. Because the whole world, the observers, agrees to use them, they become the scientific truth of our identity. The psychological impact is profound. The mind of the Ibri, trapped in the physical language of his oppressor, begins to believe that tea is the byword. His psychology becomes a reflection of the label, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of degradation. 3. The historical witness. Josephus and the physicality of judgment. Turning to the 1957 John C. Winston edition of Flavius Josephus, we find the historical data that the physicalist world uses to define us. Josephus, writing in the physical language of the Romans, provides the protocol sentences of our fall. He describes the leveling of Jerusalem, the blood in the streets, and the starvation of the people. Hungry, man. I get you, bro. So, for the Hebrew Israelite, Josephus is the eyewitness to the physical process of the divine curse. While Josephus wrote to explain the Judeans to the Romans, his work serves as a map of our displacement. He documents the movement of the Ibri. The Ibri began to be scattered. He documents the moment, the Ibri began to be scattered into the regions where they would eventually be rebranded as bywords. Josephus' history is the bridge between our glorious metaphysical past and our physicalist captive present. For the sociological ghetto, Grazel, Abrahams, and the taxonomy of exile. The works of Solomon Grazel, 1947, and Israel Abrahams, 1958, represent the attempt to organize the Jewish experience through sociological and historical lenses. Grazel provides a history shaped by the physicalist urgency of the post-World War II era. He focuses on the survival of the body of the Jewish people, often through a westernized lens that ignores the indigenous tribes in the periphery, Africa and the Americas. Abrahams explores the Jewish life in the Middle Ages, detailing the physical language of the ghetto. For the Ibri, these texts illustrate how our culture was translated into a survival mechanism. The ghetto was a physicalist laboratory where the Hebrew was compressed and forced to adapt Morano psychology's mask of an outward physical compliance while harboring a hidden internal reality. This fragmentation of the self, where the physical language of the body contradicts the private language of the spirit, is the hallmark of the Israelite in exile, or the Ibri, or the Hebrew. 5. The anthropological savage, Beals and Hoyer's scientific taxonomy. The synthesis extends into the 1950s academic world with Beals and Hoyer's introduction to anthropology. Here the proverb and byword is given the status of science by classifying the indigenous tribes as physical types and cultural stages. Anthropology provides the academic justification for the Carnapian reduction. When the anthropologist measures a school or categorizes a ritual as primitive, they are performing a physicalist translation that despiritualizes the Ibri. They see folkways where there is Torah. They see racial types where there are 12 tribes. They see folkways where there is Torah. They see racial types where there are 12 tribes. This textbook represents the intersubjective consensus of the academic world that seeks to keep the Ibri bound to the dirt, categorized as a savage specimen rather than a displaced king. That was point 5. 6. The Linguistic Key, William Chomsky and the Eternal Language. Finally, we conclude with William Chomsky's Hebrew, the Eternal Language, 1957. If Carnap's physical language is the prison, the eternal language, Lashon HaKodesh, is the key. Chomsky demonstrates that despite the physicalist efforts to kill the tongue, the eternal language survived as a latent protocol in the mind of the remnant. The psychological restoration of the Ibri depends on the rejection of the bywords, the labels of the oppressor, and the return to the original tongue. To speak Hebrew is to perform a reverse translation, moving out of the physicalist reduction of black or Indian and back into the metaphysical reality of Ibri. Language is the frequency of identity. As long as we speak the physical language of our captors, our psychology will remain subject to their protocol sentences. Conclusion: the awakening from the physicalist dream. The synthesis of these works reveals a grand architecture of concealment, from the logic of Carnap to the history of Josephus, the sociology of Grazel and Abrams, the anthropology of Beals and Heuser, and the linguistics of Chomsky. We see a world that has meticulously documented the physical process of our captivity while ignoring the spiritual truth of our identity. The proverbs and bywords are the bars of the physicalist cage. To break free, the indigenous Hebrew must recognize that its psychology is not a set of biological reactions to a savage environment, but a response to a divine calling. We must look past the physical language of the scientists and historians and return to the holy language of the covenant. We are not the specimens of anthropology textbook. We are the Ibri, the crossers, who are finally crossing back from the physical language of the world to the eternal truth of the Most High. Amen. Put some music on for you. Got no more, so you come for the music. Oh, the internet's gone.